Okay, so the first question asks us to explore piracy. And in our text, we read the title was Piracy Emerges as a Major Worldwide Problem and How Can It Be Controlled? So, in the text, we, we know piracy to be a form of larceny. And so we know that larceny is theft, stealing, and it's the prototype of most property offenses. And so, as we also learned from the text, larceny is also the most prevalent crime in our societies. So, that includes all forms of larceny, vehicle theft, pickpocketing, purse snatching, all that. And specifically, since we can take, auto theft and single it out, and art theft, we can do the same thing for boat theft. And so that is where piracy is from. When reading the text, I found myself wondering why larceny is the most prevalent form of crime in our society, and it definitely ties into socioeconomic conditions, and this is really what encourages people to commit these crimes. So, piracy is a real threat, as much a lot of people really think that it's not significant, but it's actually a really significant threat to the commercial shipping industry, as we learned. Pirates are not selective when it comes to their target, and they will attack anything that will bring in ransom money or goods to be sold. Um, in other words, nobody's safe. This can include cruise ships, sailing yachts, fishing trawlers, etc., etc. Um, and these pirates can afford these fast boats for surprise attacks and these expensive GPS equipment, and supplies that enable them to wait for the right target. And so, piracy is one of the only crimes committed on the ocean. Currently, as reported by the FBI, there's 30,000 American boats that are listed on the FBI's stolen boat file, and these have never been recovered. And unfortunately, there's not an international marine force. So it's actually really hard to police the ocean. It doesn't have borders, it doesn't have its own police, things like that. And so this is why piracy is still continuing today, and it's still an issue. And so in the text, it mentioned how a lot of the pirates, I think the example specifically was from Somalia. And these wealthy pirates are living in luxury. Meanwhile, next door to them, their neighbors are, in tin shacks. And there's kids on the streets of Somalia that are starving. And the pirates are out there driving, these expensive cars and living very lavishly. And so this definitely got me thinking, and specifically about Hershey's social bond and social control theory. And so these theories states that, all of us are born with the desire to commit crime. And the only thing that keeps us from committing crimes is our ties to conventional society. So therefore, when our ties to the conventional society are weakened, individuals are more free to commit these deviant acts. And so this made me think about the example in Somalia and how this underdeveloped country, it has a lot of people living well below poverty and well below their means. And, there's kids that are starving, things like that. And then you have these pirates that obviously do not have strong ties to the conventional society, and they're already at a disadvantage. And so when this happens, we see more deviant crimes being committed because those social bonds are weakened, and um, they don't have these opportunities otherwise. And so the second question asks us to talk about mortgage fraud. And so when we talk about mortgage fraud, all the factors leading into the recession that started in 2007, mortgage fraud was the most frequently cited. And so because of that, we have seen mortgage fraud and how if it is allowed to become unrestrained, it will place financial institutions at risk and have adverse effects on the stock market, which is not good. So according to the FBI, there's fraud for profit and then there's fraud for housing. So fraud for profit is known as industry insider fraud because 80% of reported fraud losses involve collaboration by industry insiders. Whereas fraud for housing is more so to acquire ownership of the house under false pretenses. So this could be a borrower who makes misrepresentations regarding their income or unemployment history so that they can qualify for a loan. And most of the cases mentioned in the text have to do with an insider teaming up with the builder or another party to commit these fraudulent acts. So bringing this back to conflict theory, we see the groups of power are the ones who are creating the laws and ordinances with their own interests in mind. And so I wanted to mention this theory because I feel like it explains why these third parties might get involved with the mortgage fraud scheme, and it makes sense because the more economic power you have, the more powerful you are, and those third parties, that group really tends to get the short end of the stick when it comes to criminal law. However, this theory doesn't necessarily explain why insiders also take the risk of committing these crimes. However, I think knowing you have a higher economic status, it may feel as though you are exempt from laws or might not get as harsh of punishments. And I think that we see this in the text. In the varying sentences for the insiders, some dealing with 60 months, where some is only getting a year or so sentencing. And so I think that theory really rings true in explaining the mortgage fraud. And so the last question asks about insurance fraud. And from what we know, insurance fraud is not just about within your state or your local insurance. It goes to a federal level as well. And the FBI has made investigating insurance fraud a priority because of the significance that the insurance industry has in the U.S. economy. And I did not know this, but it collects nearly $1 trillion in premiums each year, the insurance companies. And so because this industry is so huge, so large, it's making so much money, it does make it a prime target for criminal activity, unfortunately. And the CIF estimates that the cost of fraud in the industry in its highs of $80 billion each year, and this cost has been passed on to consumers in the form of higher premiums. So that explains that. And so because of this and the U.S. economy downturn, it has led to an increase in insurance fraud. And so there's a few different schemes that the book talks about. One being workers' compensation fraud, And this scheme has left, injured and deceased victims without any workers' comp coverage to pay their medical bills. Another one would be disaster fraud. So this can be when a disaster occurs and there are organizations or individuals that solicit contributions for the victims of these disasters, and not all of them are true. So other types can also include false or exaggerated claims by policyholders or misclassification of flood damage or theft, things like that. So I wanted to tie in Marx's theory of crime, which states that power and inequality are the root of the crime problem. And capitalism is that source of inequality. So this theory states that our legal systems, political systems, everything is influenced by capitalism. And I think that that's really prevalent, especially in the United States. And one example that comes to mind, are these workman comps fraud schemes where you may have an employee who's worked for a company for many, many years, and, they were wondering why would they do this, but, they've been working there maybe just as long as, if not as long as their own boss, and, they might not even be making as much money. So, that inequality and the system, the way that things work, it can really, drive people to do these crimes. And in this case, commit these fraudulent acts against a company that they might have worked for just because they feel that they put in that work and that they deserve it.